Thank you. My name is Tim Steinweg. I work for SOMO. I'm glad somebody already explained the abbreviation for me. When somebody asks me or any of my colleagues what it is that we do, we tend to have a bit of trouble explaining it in a simple and easy way. We tend to use a lot of words trying to explain what it is that we do. But I've decided to keep it simple, and I usually just say, I research stuff. Now, if the person that I'm talking to is interested in what I'm really doing, I go on and I say, well, I research where our stuff comes from. If that person is still interested, didn't walk away yet, I'll explain to him, I research under what conditions our stuff is made and under what conditions the stuff that goes into our stuff is mined. Now, this all might sound a bit stuffy, I realize that, but the question, where does stuff come from, is a really, really tricky one to answer, and a very important one if you talk about a sustainable future. Now, there's a bunch of products, there's some stuff for which this question is relatively easy to answer. And now I'm going to talk about food anyways. Except for, I mean, we all heard these stories of underprivileged inner city youth that think that milk comes from a carton box, tomatoes grow in plastic containers, all food just comes from the supermarket. For a number of products, this question is relatively easy to answer. But there's a different category of stuff for which this is a lot more complicated. Where does our car come from? What about our computer, our laptop, our mobile phone? Do we know who has made it? In what factory? Where does it come from? How much has it traveled before it ended up in our hands? These are really difficult questions, and it's not just these inner city kids that don't know the answer to this. And these are also the products for which that question really touches on sustainability. Under what conditions has our laptop been made? How can we be sure that no human rights have been violated in the mining of the products that went into these electronic products? And what I'm going to talk about is an example of where we're sure that human rights were violated. And that is the Civil War in the DRC. I first heard about the Civil War in the DRC and the link with our electronics when I was a student a few years ago. It was a comment made offhandedly by a professor who was talking about something completely different but mentioned this. And I was absolutely shocked, because now all of a sudden I had a mobile phone in my pocket, and all of a sudden this product that was in my pocket of my jeans was linked to a apparently very gruesome civil war in a country that I had only vaguely heard of, but I've never really bothered to put much thought in. And I've definitely not put a lot of thought in where that mobile phone came from. I now work for SOMO. I now do this professionally. I look into where our stuff comes from. I hear about stories such as in the DRC, a lot of other stories about our everyday products as well. And I'm still shocked and I'm still amazed about this, and I'm still very motivated to find out more about this and to try to change things. But let me go back to the example of the DRC. What's going on in the DRC is that there's a very long-standing civil war. More than 5 million people have died since the mid-1990s. It is estimated that between, or tens of thousands, or probably even hundreds of thousands of women have been raped, as a violation of women is often used as a weapon of war. Children are conscripted to fight, or they're forced to work in mines. There's forced labor, there's child labor, there's a lot of violence against innocent civilians. Now this war is very complex. It's been long-standing and it's been growing more and more complex as time went on. A recent report by the United Nations talks about 8 different armed groups that are fighting in the region. On top of that, there's the Congolese army who's involved as well. It's very, very complex to really understand what's going on. But the one element that's been constant in all of this is that they're fighting over the resources and over the money that they make from these resources. Now, it's too easy to say that that is the only cause. And it's also too easy to say that, okay, if you stop the mining or if you address the mining, then the war will end. There's a whole range of other causes to this war as well. There's the trade of illegal arms going into the country. There's smuggling of minerals across the borders. There's the lack of government infrastructure. There's very long-standing land disputes, tribal disputes, a lot of different causes. But it's undeniable that the metals mined in that region fuel the Civil War. So that brings us to the question of the electronics companies. What role do they play in this? Well, simply put, they're the ones that buy the minerals. And they don't do this directly, but it's true that every mineral mined in the DRC, some percentage of it does end up in our electronic equipment. This percentage ranges between 10 and 60% of the global demand for the 4 minerals that are mined in the region. And we're talking about gold, tin, tungsten, and tantalum. I think in total it's estimated that an average mobile phone has around 30 different metals in them. And another feature of how this ends up in our electronic equipment is that the supply chains are very long and very complex, and they're very untransparent. This is an example of all the subcomponents going into a computer. It's very, very difficult to trace how exactly the metals mined end up in our products. There's many different companies producing subcomponents of subcomponents of components that go into your mobile phone. If you ask these companies to provide insight in this, they're very reluctant, mostly out of competitive reasons. And it's very, very difficult for the general public to really get a good grip of what that supply chain looks like. Yet we as NGOs, we say that doesn't mean that these companies still bear a responsibility, because they do, because they are the ones, by producing their products, that create the demand for the minerals that are linked to the Civil War. We started engaging with these companies back in 2007. We sent them a questionnaire and we asked them, okay, well, how do you see this responsibility? Well, they didn't. They said it was too complex. It was even impossible for them to find out where their metals came from, and they were only tiny users, relatively, of the metals that we were talking about. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the details of how this process has progressed over the years, but we've now come to a point where the companies are legally obliged to show whether they use minerals from the DRC and how they apply their so-called due diligence to ensure that their demand for minerals does not create benefits for the armed groups in the DRC. So these companies, you see that there is a responsibility and that there's an acknowledgement of that responsibility. But what about us? What about us consumers? What about you and me in the room? Well, I'm fairly confident to say that every single one in this room today, if they brought their mobile phone with them, brought a little piece of the Congo with them. Now, it's not 100% sure that every single mobile phone contains elements that come from the DRC, but it's likely. And if you then look at the global production of mobile phones, for example, it's estimated that around 6,000 mobile phones are produced every single minute. So you see, and 6,000 mobile phones are sold every minute. So you see that there's a very clear role for the consumers as well. So what is it that we can do? And here it's important to point out that at this moment there's no fair trade mobile phone. There's no fair trade computer. You cannot choose one brand over the other and say, okay, I've done my part. But that's not to say that you as consumers can't do anything. In fact, I always say that there's 3 main things that as consumers you can take a responsible role. The first one is really, really simple. It's just to prolong the life of your product. Don't throw away a mobile phone if it's still usable. Don't decide to go for the latest model and disregard your old one just because it's fancier. And I used to be able to really show off with my own mobile phone up until last summer. I had a phone that was 10 years old, and I used to pull it out every time I talked about this. Unfortunately, it did break down in the end, so I was forced to buy a new one. But I'm determined to also make sure that this new phone lasts for as long as it can. That also means that I'm going to very actively try to get it repaired every time something breaks down, not just throw it away. The second thing that you as consumers can do, and other speakers have touched on this as well, very simple, is to recycle. Everyone who's selling you a mobile phone, whether it's in a store or a service provider, is forced to take back your old one, just like with a washing machine. Recycling electronics decreases the demand for newly mined materials. It's a very simple logic behind it. That decreases the pressure to mine, that decreases the pressure to get the minerals from the DRC. Now, and the third one, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more because I think it's the most important one. It's to ask questions. And you can ask questions even if you don't expect a satisfactory answer. Because asking the question in itself already creates demand. It sends out a signal that you find this important. Now, and there's a number of places and a number of situations in which you can ask these questions, and I'm just going to mention a few. You can buy the questions in the store when you buy a new product. I've done this, and I didn't get a satisfactory answer. I went to buy a new digital camera, and I asked the shopkeeper if he knew where it came from, and I basically got a really blank stare back and something like China, probably. Not a very satisfactory answer, but I think I still send out a message, and if we all send out that same message, that is going to have a positive effect. You can also ask questions after you've bought a product. After you've bought a product, you now became a stakeholder of the brand name company of your product. You can do this through various campaigns, through various internet letter signing initiatives. You can also just call them up yourself, or it could be fun to look up the social media accounts of the CEOs of the company and ask them directly. You can ask questions through the institutions that you belong to. The University of Utrecht is probably a very large buyer of computers for computer halls. If you are a student at this university, you can try to get your university to ask the same questions as I did with the shopkeeper, but then the force of that question is multiplied by the number of computers that they buy all at once. You can ask questions as a citizen, as a voting citizen. You can try to find out what politicians are saying about this topic, what they're doing about this. Ask them if you can get the chance. I'm not going to give you any voting advice, don't worry. And finally, the most important one that you should ask questions to is yourself. Is really the question, do I really need this new product? How can I take on my role as a consumer in the most responsible way? Now, is this asking such questions, is that really going to make a difference? I'm absolutely convinced that it will. Yes, it sends out such a strong message that it will make a difference. Will it directly end the war in the DRC? Well, probably not. I mean, there's a lot of different other factors that I mentioned that need to be addressed at the same time. But we can be assured that if we don't ask these questions, and if we remain silent, then nothing will change. And then solutions to gruesome wars such as in the DRC will be further away than ever. So I really encourage you to go ahead and ask questions. That's it. Thank you.